here in person, and hello to all of you on Zoom as well. It is my great pleasure to introduce our 2023 Doc Storm Distinguished Lecture Speaker, Dr. George James Kenagy, Jim. I call him Jim. Jim got his BA from Pomona College back in 1967, and a PhD from zoology from UCLA in 1972. He then went off to Germany to the Max Planck Institute and did a postdoc in behavioral physiology over there. Then came back to California to UCLA and UCSD before almost joining the Department of Zoology here, but instead joining the Department of Zoology at the University of Washington in 1967 or 76, sorry, so 1976. And then in 1995, he became the curator of mammals at the Bird Museum of Natural and Cultural History. So, it's a great honor to actually introduce Jim. He and I share a deep love of kangaroo rat incisors, of all things. And I've gotten to know Jim over many years at this point. I've shared many wonderful coffees with him. I've always appreciated how generous he is in his mentoring and his genuine interest in my research. It's always a great time talking with Jim, and it's such a pleasure to have him here. His research spans lots of different fields, primarily ecophysiology and behavior, population biology of mammals, biogeography, evolution of mammals, and like I said, incisors. He's going to give two talks today. So this is the first talk that he's giving on his research that's ongoing right now. And then you can also come this evening at 7 o'clock to the Lascelles Center. There's a catered reception beforehand, and there's going to be display tables with a bunch of show and tell that he's brought with him from the Bird Museum after the lecture. And the lecture tonight will be on surviving in the desert and coping with heat, aridity, and scarce resources. Now, before I read the title for this talk, I'm going to take a moment to acknowledge the land that OSU sits on. So we here in Corvallis at OSU are sitting on the traditional homelands of the Marys River or the Amphibian Band of the Kalapuya. And following the Willamette Valley Treaty of 1855, the Kalapuya people were forcibly moved to reservations in Western Oregon. Today, living descendants of these people are a part of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians. And I'd like to take a moment too to point out, just to honor the memory of Catherine Jones Harrison, who was a leader of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, who passed away last week at the wonderful age of 99. So with that, it is my distinct honor to introduce Jim, and he will be talking to us about mammalian reproduction, female and male allocation for time and energy, alternating capital, and income investments.
Well, good morning. Thank you. Thank you all for showing up. And I'd like to thank the Doc Storm Committee for the honor of your kind invitation to come and meet you and spend time with you this week talking about our common interests. I especially want to thank Becca Terry for her gracious efforts all along as my host. And that goes for Teresa Boland too, who is a very helpful organizer. So it's good to be here, and we're all organized, I think, with that. Okay, thank you. Oops. Got it. I'm going to save for this evening my tribute to Doc Storm and my special connections with him. I'll talk quite a bit about that, and I'll mention of his qualities as a naturalist and a professor. But this morning, and that's going to take us to the Alvord Desert and desert time. But this morning, it's all about ground squirrels, golden mallet ground squirrels. But I want to cast this story in the context of mammalian reproduction in general, which shows a huge variety of different maternal investment patterns of various degrees and intensities in gestation or pregnancy and in lactation. And of course, lactation is one of the major defining characteristics of mammals as a vertebrate class. In contrast to many mammals many animals of different kinds in which one or both parents provide access to or delivery of nutrition for their offspring, mammal females go out and they eat a whole bunch of food, they digest it, they absorb it into their bodies, and then they turn around and remanufacture that stuff into a nutritional product, which is milk, that they export from their bodies through a special area called the mammary glands to nourish their young for various periods of time that may be short, or weeks, or months, or even a year or more. So there's a lot of variation in that, but it's a distinctive pattern that places a big burden on the females of the species, and that's my emphasis today. You'll see that I like to assess parental investment in quantitative terms of energy, both the balance between intake and expenditure, which we can measure in the field, actually. We have measurements of this, but we supplement this with some measurements that we can do in the lab to put together an energy budget of the different kinds of expenditures and extraction of energy that mammals or any animals do if you take this approach. In this way, we really like to assess, to use energy as a currency for performance and fitness, actually. So my next introductory point is to give you the punchline, actually, of the golden medal ground squirrel maternal energetics part of the talk. And that's because some of my papers have been misinterpreted or misquoted with statements like lactation is the most energy demanding time in the life of mammals, which is actually not true for many mammals. There are stringencies of other kinds that are more demanding in some cases, but that statement is true of golden medal ground squirrel mothers and many other small mammals that produce sizable litters of altricial young for the following reason that is pretty dramatic. And this is not the way it is in humans or whales. At the time of peak lactation, just before the golden medal ground squirrels open their eyes, emerge above ground and start feeding, the mother is supporting a litter of 3 or 4 or 5 young who weigh more than she does. Now, think about whales and humans with a very small percentage of birth weight being that of the offspring, and even at 1 year for a mother human with a youngster that might weigh 15% of what she weighs 1 year later while it's already consuming solid food. There is a big burden of daily energy expenditure demand on female small mammals that produce altricial young. And then another surprise actually in all of this is that the rate of energy expenditure of the mothers does not, what she expends does not vary significantly with regard to the different litter size, but the milk output shows a stair-step increase that increases with litter size. So we'll come to the evidence for that kind of situation. And I'll take you through these different stages of the talk, though, before we get to the golden medal ground squirrels. First of all, just talking about energy balance in general, and then I'll look at the diversity in some, just a handful of sort of extreme different examples of different kind of mammals, and then we'll get to the ground squirrels, and that'll sort of wrap up the talk. So energy balance. And again, this energetics perspective, just a little bit more. We talk about energy, about the struggle of existence and survival and fitness as the struggle to acquire free energy to do work. And life is all about work. Energy availability and demand for expenditure vary over days and seasons. And that's what leads to seasonal breeding and occasional breeding and lifetime patterns of waiting for reproductive maturity before breeding begins. And organisms have physiological limits and capacities that they can push. And we find interesting cases, many of them involving reproduction, where animals are taken to the limits of their physiological ability to take in energy or to expend it. So, excuse me, the coping patterns of matching season or change is that animals change. And that's what physiology is all about. And behavior, the flexibility of phenotypes and the responses that exist in animal physiology and plant physiology to changing environments. We like to talk about uncoupling demand and supply. Maybe when the demand is there, if you obtain a supply earlier, you're accumulating capital ahead of time that you can invest in reproduction on more of a pay-as-you-go basis. So there's this kind of trade-off that's talked about in reproductive energetics between capital and income models. So there's a lot of compensation and prioritization among alternative allocations, sequencing different stages of gestation, lactation, and the other aspects of reproduction that we'll see as part of animal breeding. An energy budget, like the bar on the left, is an example of a non-reproducing animal. And we can talk about reproductive allocation being an addition, as in the red there at the addition model, or compensation, giving up some of the energy budget of maintenance in order to reproduce, or some stringencies in some physiological systems where the increase may not be very great. When we start to develop the energy budgets that I'll show you in a very simple summary, eventually for the ground squirrels, we can compartmentalize the basal existing or resting metabolism for a warm-blooded animal, a homeotherm expenditure of energy in colder environments that increases the colder it gets, and then simple behavioral activities of alertness, and then finally the more expensive aspects of moving around, whether it's walking or running, and we've compartmentalized that for ground squirrels according to their expenditures and their energy budgets in the field. So when the animals reproduce, we have to add for the males in preparation of the testes in order to produce sperm, and some behavior that is stimulated through changes in hormones that add to the energy budget. But in general, we're going to see the mammal case of the male contribution ultimately being less energy demanding. During gestation, females are producing little youngsters inside and changing some behavior that may include increased foraging. And then during lactation, can be generally greater daily expenditures and more behavior. And then that milk that I'm showing up at the top is the export, which is energy that was inside the mother's body. But all the chemical energy in the bonds of milk is transferred to the young. And yet it's part of her budget because she had to take it in the first place and digest it and produce it. So we'll account for milk as an export product when we look at lactation energy budgets. So now let's look at a few of these examples where gestation and lactation vary across mammal mother strategies, and some extreme balances, especially when I show you some marsupial examples, for example. But body size is a big deal. The whales will come to momentarily as an extreme, the differences between male and female, and then the life history of animals, how long they live. Do they have a lot of chances to reproduce, or they do it only once or twice? And the bigger mammals live longer and have more opportunities. Simul parity is rare in mammals, just breeding once. And then how many young can they produce? All of this life history development, and then including whether young or altricial or precocial, places a different burden on the timing of the mother's energy demand. And that has to be met with the food, and when the food is available, and environmental seasonality and so on. All of these stages of the physiological productive process can be altered. They can be reversed in the case of induced ovulation, where copulation occurs and then the ovulation occurs. Fertilization can be pretty quick, and it always is. But implantation can be delayed. A blastocyst in many mammals can remain in the uterus to implant at a time that allows the birth to occur at a time when, for example, mating colonies of marine mammals may gather on a beach to breed following the time when the mothers have just given birth. So there's a lot of variation in that, and then particularly, as I've been suggesting, in gestation and lactation. So across all of the mammals, we find a lot of this variety. And here's the whale case where you can't say that a 2 or 3 ton baby is trivial. But on the other hand, in the 100-foot long blue whale, the biggest mammal on Earth and the biggest animal that's ever lived, that's only 1% of mother's body mass. And that is not the case in humans and in a lot of other mammals, where it's increasingly a greater percentage. So it's a rather modest production, frankly, and I don't like to trivialize the blue whale. But in fact, the gestation to produce that youngster also lasts nearly a year. So it's a very gradual, slow production. And we don't know a whole lot of the details of the maternal offspring behavior, but evidence of lactation suggests that it goes on for at least a half a year. But this is another example of young who, when born, begin feeding very shortly after being born, as opposed to being entirely dependent on milk during the earlier peak phase of lactation. So there's one extreme example. I mentioned the gray whale just because of another wild card that comes in quite rare among the whales is the migration. And just because we know these animals so well here, the tremendous feeding in the Arctic, you probably know a lot about that because we know these whales so well, is important, but they do their mating and calving underway during migration, in which they're not necessarily doing a lot of feeding to get to the nurturing grounds in Baja California where the young are raised. So there's another part of the equation in these well, considerably smaller whales, but they're still whales nonetheless. This is one of the most remarkable examples of an extreme situation. How about a 4-day lactation? Wouldn't that be nice, Mom, if it only lasted 4 days? Well, if you're a mother-hooded seal, you weigh 200 kilograms and you give birth to a youngster, usually one, who weighs 12.5% of your body mass, which is a really big youngster. But 4 days later, the baby has doubled its weight. So you probably know the conservation problem and the concerns of the hunting practices in which these little animals are taken very easily because they can hardly move. This is one of the weaned pups that's just a big blob of fat because now it's absorbed all that milk and it's got to metabolize and get its body organized to turn the fat into muscle. And so the burden is placed on the youngster after the mother gives up all of her capital investment in 4 days to this little helpless, chubby youngster who then has the responsibility of trying to grow up. Anyway, this is, I think, is a really interesting and an extreme example of a different pattern of gestation, lactation, and maternal burden. I mentioned bats because of their flying. And mothers can't fly around with big litters of youngsters during pregnancy if they have to be airborne. And that's the reason that so many bats, including our regional important insectivorous bats, only produce one young. So the burden of the gestation and even the lactation is relatively minor in these animals because of the aerial, the need for flight and being able to remain airborne. Another really interesting feature, even though these little bats are about the same size as so many rodents, they live for 15, 20, 25 years, so they have great longevity. So there's an adjustment of life history that matches this, unlike corresponding rodents of these size who may only live for 2 or 3 years at most maximum. What else? Bigger animals like the red deer, which are like our elk really, where one young is born and lactation lasts a long time, but you can see the milk output in that graph is quite high for a while, but these youngsters are feeding very shortly after birth, and the milk production plays an increasingly smaller role as the youngsters really begin to feed very shortly after birth. So again, feeding biology, natural history, body size play in. Now it's time to jump to a marsupial example, which really is a different ballgame. These mouse-sized marsupials in Australia, the Antechinus, are semiparous. They only breed once in their life, most of the smaller species, but the gestation is very short, but the mother is giving birth to attach onto her 8 teats of 8 tiny little youngsters who are the size of a grain of rice. They weigh 11 milligrams. That's a pretty small investment. But the other side of all of marsupial maternity is lactation, in that lactation lasts for 3 months. It takes 40 days to get those youngsters up to the size of a baby mouse at birth. So basically the mammary glands are taking over the role of the mammary glands occupy the role of the placenta and of gestation in these marsupials because the the gestation is so short, and that part of the commitment is so brief. Let's jump actually to big kangaroos, which really do something different. The biggest kangaroos, the red kangaroo, are nearly the size of humans. And when they give birth to a youngster, it weighs 1 gram, the size of a baby mouse. Now that is easy on the womb if all you have to do as a huge human-sized marsupial is give birth to a little mouse-sized thing. But again, the mammary glands take over, and they take over and operate the whole system in a sequence of 3 different generations that can go on at the same time, shown here. There could be a fertilized embryo, a blastocyst, in the uterus that is not implanted, that is waiting on hold. And it's waiting in turn, in line, politely, for the next 2 stages to move on. And for the little bitty youngster who's in the pouch, that little guy, to hop out and be like this one here. The one who's out of the pouch is suckling on the mother on a kind of teat that produces a low protein, high fat milk. And she's producing a different quality of milk to this little youngster who is permanently, tenaciously attached to the teats, just as in the previous little marsupial. They don't come and go, they hook on and stay there. It's just like a placental connection, except it's a mammary nipple connection. So the seasonality and success of breeding in this kind of a marsupial is just a continual process. And if things get good in the desert, then these young survive. If things are bad, they all die, but the mother keeps mating, and the system just keeps operating in hopes that things will turn out right, and they generally do from time to time. This is a very strange and different to our normal way of thinking of what we know about so many other mammals. Briefly, carnivores have a lot of different social organization, but a lot of cases where both male and female bring food, which helps the mother feed and then eventually bring food for little youngsters. So there are a lot of different patterns in the carnivores. And then there's some very different patterns in some rodents. The South American group to which guinea pigs belong, and these degus that we've studied in Chile, show very long gestation of a small litter, and then youngsters who are born with their eyes open and fur who can feed within a few days, as opposed to the typical altricial baby rodents and other small mammals in our rodent groups in the Northern Hemisphere that produce patterns more like the golden mountain ground squirrel. So this is a switch off between producing a really mature baby at birth that can take care of itself pretty well and only requires a couple of weeks of lactation. Finally, the shrews, the tiniest of the tiniest of mammals who can't hibernate to get through the winter, but have very intense metabolism and reproduction is an almost unimaginable feat in them. And it's not very well studied, but they are, so many of them, smaller than the smaller rodents and have a huge female reproductive burden. Okay, well, that's enough of the female burden. I'm briefly going to talk about an interesting old paper of ours that has continued to get lots of citation. I'm kind of proud of the title of this. It gives us a moment to have some male perspective, and then we'll get back to the important female perspective. The title is very straightforward. It expresses an equation, the size and function of mammalian testes in relation to body size, which we did as a literature survey in allometry, which we didn't bother to use that word in the title, which gives us an opportunity to look at what is the relative mass of testes for males of different body size across all orders of mammals. And one of the interesting questions that got us interested in doing this survey was the relative size. So once you have this equation, the next question becomes, is a given species testis size? It's the weight of 2 testes that we had to verify were in reproductive condition, not immature. So we had to carefully comb the literature to find those cases of 2 mature testes per species at maximum size. Are they below or above the line? And the question had been, the issue had been pointed out in primates that in monogamous or single male systems, the testes on average were relatively small, with one being testes that fall on that equation line and 0.5 being below the line. Monogamous cases where males only need to be concerned with finding one female do not need to produce as much sperm. And the multi-male systems of promiscuity, polygyny, and polygamy have bigger testes because males are out competing for multiple matings with females. This had been pointed out in primates, and we discovered that it was true of many other mammal groups. And one really interesting case is actually among the whales. These are the odontocetes, or toothed whales, way above the line. And the dolphin and porpoise biologists all got excited and confirmed that there were a lot of cases of lots of very rampant running around male behavior among all of these whales, whereas the baleen whales have testes that are well below the line, and they do not have multiple male competing systems. They're the elephants in there. Quickly, just a separate graph. This rodent is the rodent that inspired me, the grasshopper mice, to do this study when I discovered this one species and was amazed that the testes were well over 10% of the body mass. And we don't know that much about the mating system, but it suggests that there's a lot of competition going on. Some of you were not paying attention to this because you notice the beaver out here. And I'm determined today and this evening to mention beavers as I can. And you'll see the beaver below the line there. But this is nothing to be ashamed of. Beavers are monogamous, okay? It's modest. It's a good way to do things. And if you don't need it, you don't have to produce it. So that's my beaver moment for male reproduction. And if I can get the thing to click on, goodbye, Benny. We'll see you later. There we go. We're ready to talk about the ground squirrels. Kenneth Gordon, who was Doc Storm's advisor, produced during the war, after Doc Storm did his master's and went off to fight in the Second World War, produced this 100-some page monograph about golden male ground squirrels and yellow pine chipmunks. A very sweet and interesting set of his own observations that he just took time to do during the war where things shut down. And he had been doing a lot of interesting behavioral studies of the animals. And I like to point out one thing he says at the very end of the book about, well, what else don't we know? He says, lucky is the person who could live close to them through the seasons, mark them and follow them individually through their life cycle. Well, that's what I got to do. And one of the chapters in my book is, in fact, about golden mallet ground squirrels, where I say the summer warmth, blue skies, and smell of ponderosa pine attracted me first as a youngster and always welcomed me back to what I think of as my favorite mountain habitat on the dry east side of the Cascade Mountains. My first memories of this forest were my childhood in Oregon, and I returned to the ponderosa in my adult life in Washington. The iconic animal inhabitant of these woods for me was the golden mallet ground squirrel, the little charmer who always showed up in the campgrounds on picnic tables and so on. And my most important pet as a youngster when I grew up in Redmond, Oregon, was my golden mallet ground squirrel. So we need things to inspire us to decide what we want to study. And in the 1980s and 90s, I had a series of NSF grants, a lot of activity with students and various colleagues to produce a series of papers in the 80s and 90s that are quickly shown here for you to look at, involving the annual cycle of reproduction of a population of golden mallet ground squirrels in the Washington Cascades at about a 2,000-foot elevation on a hillside that had some logging in it. We had a study area of about 50 acres, 276 traps, about 100 feet apart, a lot of up and down the hill hiking of a big field crew to actually trap and examine these animals for stretches of time every day to determine when they come out of hibernation, when they mate, when do they give birth, how do they grow, and all this kind of stuff. And that's the source of a lot of the field data I'll show you. from this lovely site up in the Cascades with ponderosa and Doug fir, kind of an open habitat because of the recent logging. The hypogeous fungi that you see here, the truffles in a scraped away bit of soil, end up being an important part of the diet, as is all of the salad bar that we called it, of Brownsel and other greens that come on in the spring. And this moment right here is where I will do my official acknowledgements of a great number of students, postdocs, field assistants, sabbatical visitors, and many other colleagues and friends who made up our team of often 5 people at a time working in the field during the intense work and corresponding work that we were doing in the lab to put together the energy budgets, and then acknowledging the National Science Foundation for a whole lot of generous support. You see, sometimes you have to work with a shovel just to get in and set the traps up to get the season started. This female right here is wearing a radio collar, and that's her young. Part of our routine involved radio collaring, which was kind of a new thing for small mammals at the time. And in order to know where the nest is of each female, so we would know where to await her in the morning to begin a day of all-day follow observations, or near the end of lactation to know where the young were going to be coming up, so we could count how many they are and go in and catch them and determine the litter size, weigh them at birth, and all this kind of stuff. So there's a pretty intense effort involved in this kind of studying a marked population, and it was a lot of fun, but it was a lot of work. The annual cycle actually involves 7 or almost 8 months of hibernation, so that's pretty simple. You don't have to do a whole lot of field work then. You get to go home and rest and recover. But the males emerge in late March when there's some snow already, typically on the ground, and the mating occurs. And then it's this sequence of events in a one litter a year effort that involves the mating, gestation of about a month, lactation about 5 weeks till the young come above ground, then a recovery period, and then the hibernation. This graph of body weight I'm going to talk about quite a bit because it tells a remarkable story just in this big set of multi-year body weight data, where I'm going to start with the females. Look at this. Females emerge from hibernation at 150 grams. They end the season at 300 grams. They ovulate in an emaciated body condition within a couple of days of emerging, with the males, bingo, big body weight, who need to be in shape to run around and find females. And the males, in fact, tend to emerge a week or so before the females are even coming up out of hibernation. This growth right here is not all the litter. This drop right here represents the birth of the young. The females are simply restoring their totally emaciated body condition, preparing to deliver the clutch of 3 or 4 or 5 young typically, and then to have their lactation period here, and then finally fattening to prepare for hibernation. The males only fluctuate on the order of 25 or a little bit more grams during the year. And there's a totally different feeding biology and not a bunch of fat behind it that in fact involves the males hibernating, needing to wake up from hibernation to get the testes up and running, which requires more than a month. And some of this work has been done by other people and other ground squirrels, including other species of golden mountain ground squirrels. So the females are able to ovulate very quickly after the last time they're torpid, but the males are surviving on a cache of truffles that they take in during the late summer and the fall as part of what allows them to maintain their body weight so they can fire up and be ready for breeding. Then during the busy breeding mating season, they lose some weight and then gain gradually here. Now take a look at the youngsters here. They have to stay up before they have to grow up from 62 grams up here. Males and females pretty much on the same curve. Maybe the males are starting to show a difference, but males at that body mass cannot go into hibernation and come back and compete with these guys the next year. And this is not a beaver metaphor, but it is a football metaphor of an ineligibility to reproduce, which my technician documented with this little metaphorical red shirt costume that we put on one of our guys to illustrate that the young men have to sit it out for a year. In fact, their testes do not develop and they don't come into puberty till the second year. On some occasions, small numbers of yearling males have come into breeding condition. Okay, well, that's sort of it for the male story. We need to come back to this cycle and look at things like the temperatures that we measured in the soil in the field so that we could project the metabolic rate of the animals while they're hibernating. This is a little bit more of the feeding biology from April, May, June, and so on to see this variety. This is from some thousands of individual observations of what are the dietary things that we see a squirrel eating. And so these are all little green salad type things. The groundsel is the most important of those. But this column here shows the increasing importance of the hypogeous fungi, the truffles, in the diet of both males and females, but particularly late in the season of the males taking those things into cache. Our observation from trapping of space occupied shows the hugest home range on the order of nearly 10 acres, that's in hectares, of males during the mating season that drops off. In females, here's the home range at the mating. The home range is greatest during lactation when the feeding demand is the greatest and the females have to move around over a bigger area to find all the best food they can that then declines. So a lot of that comes from trapping and from observation of the animals. And this is just the life cycle of the groundsel, which is luscious, wet vegetation when they need the water, and then it dries up. And in fact, when the females finally enter hibernation in the adults in August, it's the hottest days of the year. So hibernation is not a response to snow and cold temperature. It's just that the energy reserves have been accumulated for breeding next year. And so they begin their hibernation in August. But this green vegetation is critical to the lactation of the females. We have measured in the lab a lot of metabolic rates in terms of oxygen consumption and respirometry. We can equate that to kilojoules per animal or per gram per day and so on. Some of this included a treadmill respirometer in which we measured the walking metabolic rate at less than half a meter per second and a much higher metabolic rate running up to 4 or 5 meters per second, which is about half the speed of the human 10-second 100-meter race. But running is something right up at the aerobic limits of capacity and not done for more than 10 or 15 seconds at a time when the animals are commuting long distances or escaping predators. And the walking gait is the more typical one for foraging. So, but we've quantified all these things, including thermoregulatory costs being double at 0 degrees of what they are at 10 degrees to put into our energy budget for the annual year. And you can see month by month, very low expenses when you're hibernating. And then during the active season for males and females, these different components adding up. Here's the export of milk in females. And all this adds up into the total annual budget by these different categories of behavior that we time in the field through our behavioral observations with, again, this big more than 20% export of energy. So we've got all the numbers there. And one of the things that we then could do in the field is to use a stable isotope system of oxygen-18 and deuterium. And before that, we had used some tritium to measure the turnover of water and the production of carbon dioxide that we can equate in kilojoules to the actual metabolism of animals in the field. You have to take a blood sample from the animal, you have to inject these isotopes, get an initial reading, and then typically 48 hours later, catch the animal again and take a blood sample. And by computation, you actually measure the metabolic rate. This is nicknamed the doubly labeled water method, and not a whole lot of people are using it right now, but it's a way to measure the total energy metabolism in the field. And this was our first run at that at 3 different parts of the season, showing no big surprise during the mating period, the male has its highest metabolic rate at about 2.5 times the basal metabolic rate. There's literature that likes to talk about the capacity of energy expenditure in mammals and birds being on the order maximum of about 4 times metabolic rate. Well, look at these first measurements during mid and late lactation in females at 3.5 times basal metabolic rate, much higher than anything the male ever shows. And we go on after this, this very first measurement of daily energy expenditure to collect a series of measurements in females at the peak of lactation. This is more general lactation, which occurs at days 31 through 35 that we determined just before, well, the eyes open in the young are 29, 30 days, and the young come above ground on days 36 or 37. So knowing when the female gave birth, we're prepared to do the isotope study just at that peak time. And the next measurements I'll show you are for those more specialized measurements of metabolic rate. And here they are at days 31 through 35. Well, the line is always interesting to look at, and that's where we look when we run our regressions and so on. But what I think is much more interesting is this huge variation in this larger data set of all these different females. And these females down here are producing 5 young, and they're doing it for less daily energy expenditure than these females doing 3. And so you can see that the overall variation is huge compared to the very slight increased slope there, which is kind of pulled down by these litters of the smaller females who have perhaps lost young or early during lactation, or not implanted a more full litter size of 3, 4, or 5. So this more extensive data set that we accumulated in later years, over a number of years, gave us a more thorough handle on the intensity of female lactation. And then this shows the loss of weight being greater, how many grams per day are being lost in the latter part of lactation is greater in the bigger females. That shows that there is some fat in there that is going into the energy budget, and that the females with bigger litters give up more body mass as a contribution to what otherwise is being met by their foraging intake. We have done detailed all-day follows, which is an important kind of behavioral work that not a lot of people are doing anymore, as opposed to attaching accelerometers or doing other things and then going back in the lab and watching your computer. Field assistants with relief trading back and forth will be stationed at a burrow from the moment a mother comes above ground. And these records here are for mother golden mallet ground squirrels during days 31 to 35 of lactation, in which the mother is above ground in part foraging for nearly 10 hours a day. But invariably, and absolutely every female that we studied in late lactation, they showed 2 bouts of activity with a midday absence from the field. That is a time to go down and unload milk on the youngsters. So 2 bouts of activity per day with a midday lactation. And then of course, lactation is available after they return to the burrow for the night and stay with the young overnight until the next morning. The time allocation of this time above ground, we partition into nearly 2/3 of the time the female is sitting. She doesn't go back in the burrow to be protected from predators, or where she leaves the kids in the kindergarten and rests, watch vigilantly, digests. She can't consume food for 9 hours, but she moves around about 1/3 of the time. And of that time, this fraction of the movement time is either ingesting food or seeking food and pulling food and then stopping at some place and ingesting. So that's the breakdown of activity, those mothers when they're on the surface. And we'll come back to that in a special case in a little bit. But this now is sort of the overall budget that we put together for intake and expenditure based upon having studied the animals in the lab, where we can measure the amount of daily food consumption, its energy content, the digestion process, collection of the feces that is the net unabsorbed energy from the food that's eaten, and we use bomb calorimetry to measure the energy content of the food, so that the contribution for mothers of 3, 4, or 5 young is shown here in terms of the amount of food, plus S is the storage, the amount of body fat being given up, body mass loss, which is a little bit greater in the mothers producing 5 young. And then the metabolic rates here. So the highest rates we ever measured were in the mothers of 5 litters at 3.7 times basal metabolic rate. That's pushing that limit that seems to appear in a lot of mammals and birds, endotherms, for what's the most accelerated metabolism you can show on a daily basis. This line right here is from an allometric analysis of energy intake, which also shows limits at around 6 times basal metabolic rate. And that for golden male and ground squirrels would be this line here. So it shows that the females, oh, sorry, I have to break this down. This down here is from the doubly labeled water measurement of the actual metabolism of the female, different litter size. The P is the production, or the milk that leaves her body in order to produce the young that weigh the amount they do, based upon lab and field studies, knowing that the young are born at a certain mass and that they emerge at 62 grams after 36 days. So there's more milk produced here. The milk production shows an increase that matches the litter size. And this is our overall budget, suggesting that indeed the expenditure rate is near the limits for mammals, and the intake rate is also up at the limits. This is basically what I've just said, but from the graph again, the variation is huge and much smaller than you'd expect. You don't see a stair-step increase in metabolism with litter size that's as great as the stair-step increase in the actual milk production of mothers producing 4 instead of 3 or 5 instead of 4 young. In any event, this model of reproductive energy allocation is certainly one of income, in that nearly all of the energy that goes into this is this intensive feeding in order to produce enough milk to produce 3 or 4 or maybe even 5 young. We did an experiment feeding animals in the field. This will be sort of the last little bit that I'll come to. We, from day 5 through day 35, went around every morning knowing where the burrow was of each female, because at the end of the afternoon, we go around with the radio system, make sure they do actually, because of weasels and martins and so on, we see quite often a mother will move her litter to a different burrow when there's been a predatory threat. So we have to check that she's still in the same system. And where she was the night before, we showed up the next day and gave 120% daily ration of lab chow and peanuts and sunflowers, all measured out, that increased from day 5 through day 36. And we basically fed these animals like the ones in the lab where the mother had all the food she needed and didn't need to forage so much. Well, instead of pups coming above ground at 62 grams, these big hulking 100 and some gram babies showed up. They were wonderful. And the whole litter mass was greater in the fed mothers. And the litter size is just a statistical matter of, we didn't know how big the litters were going to be, but whether it's survival or just the initial litter, there's a small but insignificant difference there in the litter size. But here are the doubly labeled water data, very interesting. Look at this again. The open circles or boxes, whatever they are, were the fed mothers. And we're finding the energy expenditure is right in the same range. It just falls among all the other females. The dark ones being the natural mothers in the large data set. So there was nothing about feeding that accelerated the metabolism. They couldn't fire off more kilojoules of energy, but they could produce more milk, and that's the difference. The big difference in behavior we documented, though, was a lot of fun. Here's the pattern we see for typical females. Instead of the typical pattern of nearly 10 hours on the surface, the mothers being fed were only above ground a little more than 6 hours. They were getting plenty of food down below. We didn't give them any water, in fact. So they were coming up and getting hitting the salad bar to get water, apparently, and to just try to live a normal life. But they were at a much reduced total amount of time on the surface. And that meant then that the midday downtime for lactation or just being with the young was more than twice what it was in these fed mothers who produced the 100-gram monsters than in the normal mother. So that sort of goes along with an expectation. And the carry forward effect was kind of interesting. This shows the mass of mothers when they gave birth that were not different. Because we fed these mothers, the fed mothers had a significantly greater body mass when they weaned their young. But interesting, it didn't carry forward. By the end of the season, the difference between those mothers had disappeared. It turned out there was no survival advantage. This is a minor detail of monitoring in the population of the fed youngsters or the natural ones. So the main thing was just our physiological result that there was nothing about feeding that could accelerate the metabolism, but it allowed a behavioral compensation that allowed those mothers to produce more young. We did a lot of other experiments. We did a lot of other things that were fun, but I've just about got to the point to conclude these things I've already said, that these animals with this terrific intensive maternal commitment of energy expenditure to lactation appear to be operating at or near the limits of both intake and expenditure for a small mammal. There's huge variation in the mother's daily expenditure with respect to litter size, and we think that is just the efficiency and the experience of the females moving around, that if you can do it with less energy and raise 5, then that's fine. But that's that big variation among all the individual females at different litter size. So the more productive individuals may avoid a daily expenditure as high as those of perhaps the younger individuals. And indeed, remember, the yearling females are part of this sample. They are all breeding as yearlings, and they tended to have lower body masses and smaller litters and so on. The food supplement experiment showed that we could reduce the amount of activity and allow for more milk production to produce bigger youngsters, but that the rate of energy expenditure was the same. So I think I've said just about enough, and I've drawn the conclusions from the ground squirrels, and I hope you've been impressed with the idea of the breadth of what different kinds of mammals, not just wonderful golden mound ground squirrels, can do to acquire and spend energy, and that it's done in such different ways in marsupials and in placentals, in small mammals and big mammals. And it's something worthy of study in mammals of any size or ilk, or in birds or lizards or insects or whatever kind of animal you're interested in studying. So I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to talking about Doc Storm and the desert this evening. So thank you very much. We want to do some questions? Yeah, Mark? Cross what? Sorry. I'm sorry, just a minute. Just say that a little louder. Yes. Yeah. Oh, we only did that casually. We did not publish anything on that. We did notice the one thing I mentioned after the fact that the young were on the low end of everything as yearlings. But there might be some statistical significance to doing that if I want to publish another paper. But no, that's a good question. Anybody else? Yeah.
Yeah,
Jeff.
so given the wide range of thousand models, there's like 3 species there. Do you know if this kind of litter size to energy expenditure relationship holds across like different habitats? The habitat say it has A's that kind of bird but it could be different sanitary base than what we have juniper and those that for a low tree line with their population.
Okay, Jesse's asking about different golden mallet ground squirrel populations. By the way, I'll say that our golden mallet ground squirrels in Washington Cascades are a different species from those in your Oregon Cascades. You have lateralis, we have saturatus. In our Blue Mountains and in Northeast Washington, we also have lateralis in Washington. I could have given a pretty even more interesting reply to your question had we not had a forest fire that destroyed a population we were studying at high elevation, where we hope to demonstrate some effects like that. It was well, you never get to do everything you want to do. And I think there could be some interesting differences in these. There is a third species of golden mallet ground squirrels, a tiny, not very golden thing in the Sierra Madre of Durango, Mexico, that I had always wanted to go see, and I've never seen it. That certainly has a different life history and would have been a good thing to put into a research grant as an excuse to go down to Mexico. So actually, Dr. Gordon in his 100-page monograph talked about different populations of golden mallet ground squirrels in different areas, and we could use that as a literature search for what you want to look at, Jesse. Something else?
Yeah, thanks for this talk, Jim. I'm curious if you looked at sort of top-down effects on this behavior and energy expenditure. Did predators have any effect on how the females were moving around, when they would spend time out of den?
Sure. We would call our observations casual. We in approaching 10 years, we never saw a goshawk or a bird take a golden mallet ground squirrel, but weasels and martins were the predators, and there was fascinating warning calls and anti-predator activities and so on. The pressure there, the thing I just mentioned, moving burrows, sometimes during 5 weeks of lactation, a female could move 3 or 4 times, and it's a very precarious thing that made all of the field workers nervous to see a mother making 3 or 4 or 5 trips between point A and point B. But they do it at a point when the predators are not there. They don't do it at the moment that the weasel's there, when all of the squirrels are screeching around with this noise. See, another thing I was going to say about the predation is, before we used radio collars, we had to do a lot more visual work to find out where burrows were. There is a very strong behavior, and other people have documented this, in not wanting to be seen going into your burrow when a human observer is there. And so they are wary of revealing those little secret holes. And the burrows with the young in them are not the big holes you see in the campground next to the picnic table. They are off in some very obscure place under a bush. And so there's a lot of anti-predatory behavior. But no, we have not measured, not actually even being there as much as we were, seen enough predation to have done a legitimate predatory study. But everybody likes to know about predation, so thanks. Something else, anybody? Oh, Bob?
All right, I'll ask the obvious one, the global climate change.
What? Climate change, yeah. Yeah. No, I haven't do it. There's an article that appeared in Science on Arctic ground squirrels a week ago about the change in the date of emerging from hibernation. Now, all of those data are about hibernation. What we really need to know is phenotypic flexibility. If they're induced ovulators, can they always end up mating, and will reproduction be successful? So we need to study reproduction, not just hibernation. And of course, Emeritus Kenagy is kind of out of the picture. I don't have a grant for studying climate change effects, but maybe Jesse and Becca and the rest of you can do that. That's the big question. So thanks. Yeah.
I was thinking about with the whales, that one of their big problems as young is that they're birthed into water. And so they lose their heat much faster. So did you ever have enough temperature gradients in your study system to look at thermoregulatory impacts on like gestation length or lactation costs? I mean, they're underground, so it's,
No, we of course, we raised animals under one standard set of conditions in the lab. And we did not, as I've done for kangaroo rats, and we'll talk about tonight, discover how deep the nests are in the burrow, but we made an estimate of the temperature of the burrows that we used for our hibernation metabolism effect. So I guess I'd say I don't know an answer to what you asked, if I got your question right. Yeah, I looked